Last week I promised you that if something happened, I would give you a lighthearted sermon, and in a historic comeback never seen before, the Washington Nationals did in fact clinch the World Series. So, in honor of that momentous occasion in the life of our community, I offer you the following homily on how baseball is the most orthodox of sports. This is part inspired by one of my favorite comedy bits, which you probably have heard, and if you haven't, look it up today later, by George Carlin, Baseball versus Football. How many of you know this piece? A few of you. Okay, you all have to get to know this. This is great. Here's a little taste of it, of some of the comparisons that he makes so that you can get the flavor of it. Baseball is a 19th century pastoral game. Football is a 20th century technological struggle. Baseball is played on a diamond in a park, the baseball park. Football is played on a gridiron in a stadium, sometimes called Soldier Field or War Memorial Stadium. Baseball begins in the spring, the season of new life. Football begins in the fall, when everything is dying. And it goes on from there. And those aren't the best ones. And I have to admit, I have been, most of my life, more of a football fan than a baseball fan, but as a kid, I loved them both. And there's something about being at a baseball game for me that is so reminiscent of my childhood, of lazy summer days in Michigan, rooting for, in my case, the Detroit Tigers. And my mom, bless her, remained faithful to the sport her whole life, even when I did not, and I know that she would be extremely happy with what took place last week here for the Nats. And so as we were talking about baseball last week, Deacon Nicholas started me thinking about baseball in a new way. He suggests that baseball might be our sport, the most orthodox of sports, because after all, it is unbound by time. We do not know when the game will end. To be fair, there is indeed much about the experience of a baseball game, which is, we could call, liturgical. The opening invocation of civil piety, with the singing of the national anthem that gives you a chill down your spine. Also the rowdy singing of Take Me Out to the Ball Game. The throwing of the first ceremonial pitch. The food vendors crying out their wares, their petitions like deacons. And the many different at-bat rituals of the players. Many local traditions also occur in baseball, of course. You are familiar with Sweet Caroline, and now we have our own, the Baby Shark. All of these add to what is almost a feeling of mystique, as if when you enter into the ball game, the ballpark, you are entering into some kind of hallowed ground in which the normal rules of reality no longer apply, but something magical and miraculous is waiting to happen. Very different. George Will, in his great book on the art and craft of baseball, points out that baseball has its roots far back in this young nation's antiquity. The absence of the clock in baseball is a product of pre-industrial sensibilities. They played baseball before they had to worry about how much time was on the clock. But perhaps it goes even deeper. Bart Giamatti once said, ballparks exist because there is in humanity a vestigial memory of an enclosed green space as a place of freedom or play. And indeed, if you ever see an icon depicting paradise, it is often depicted as an enclosed, almost diamond-shaped, walled garden. And play, though, is what baseball is, first and foremost. Will also says, some say that sports builds character. Others say sport reveals character. But baseball, at its best, puts good character on display in the context of cheerfulness. The umpire says, play ball, not work ball. And Carlin says, baseball, it's like a picnic-like atmosphere, and there's not much unpleasantness. But at a football game, by the end, you've known 27 times that you are capable of taking another human life. So baseball is paradisical for us. Being able to experience play is, in fact, an essential part of what it means to return to God, to become close to Him. The Gospel of St. Matthew tells us this story. Jesus called a little child to Him and set him in the midst of them and said, assuredly, and you should always pay attention when Jesus says assuredly, assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. This is a salvation issue. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. And childhood in the baseball game is a beautiful example of that. Yet at the same time, baseball is an incredible parallel to the spiritual life and the struggle that we must all face in this world. George Will also says the following things about baseball, which we could also apply just as equally to what it means to be a dedicated and faithful Christian in the world. First, everything is more difficult than it looks. 2, baseball is a game of normal human proportions, but abnormally small margins. And lastly, baseball, the game of failure, is all risks, the odds being what are against almost anything you try. I know it's hard. The very game of baseball is itself a metaphor for the struggle against sin. The batter, if you will, is the Christian who must, against all odds, overcome the deception and temptation of the devil. I was telling Jim Jatras about my idea for this sermon, and he gave me a great idea. He made the point. He said, the devil literally is the pitcher. Because the Greek word for devil, diabolo, which we normally translate as accuser or slanderer, one who hurls insults, literally comes from 2 Greek words, dia and valo, through and I throw the ball. I throw the ball through. I'm the pitcher. The devil is the pitcher. He hurls his slanders at us, tries to get us to fall for it. And our job is to resist them, to avoid the ones we can easily avoid, but also resist and strike back at the ones that we can hit with faith. Sandy Koufax said that he became a good pitcher when he quit trying to keep batters from hitting the ball and started making them hit the pitches he wanted them to hit. And that's how the devil works in our life too. It's not so much if he can get us to avoid being virtuous, it's just the little compromises that he gets us to make. The great left-hander Warren Spahn said, hitting is timing, pitching is upsetting timing. How often does the devil affect us? Not in anything that normally would be bad, but it just hits us at the right moment of vulnerability when we're not ready for it. And Orel Hershiser, who's credited, in fact, with inventing the Tebow long before Tim Tebow ever took the field, was even more subtle in his theory of pitching. He said, there are 2 theories of pitching. One is that you try to convince the batter that a particular pitch is coming, and then you throw something different. The other theory, which I use, is that if the batter expects a particular pitch, you throw it almost there. And if you want to know how the devil gets you the easiest and the most often, it's those things that are almost right or almost okay, but they're just a little bit off. Remember that at one time, the entire unity of Christendom hung on one letter in the Nicene Creed, homoousios or homoousios, of one essence or of similar essence. Sometimes it's that narrow. And so these theories of pitching may be the most succinct description of the activity of the devil in our lives. Yet baseball is unlike other sports in that it offers a measure of forgiveness. As Carlin pointed out, in football you receive a penalty. In baseball, you make an error. In baseball, you get 3 strikes. And in fact, as long as you are trying and you get a piece of that ball and you hit it, but it goes foul, it's okay. You can keep batting forever. I don't know what the record is, but I'm sure I've seen some games where one after another, until finally it's a walk or a strikeout or a hit. And this is pretty much a fair description of Christian life. We're mostly hitting fouls every day and occasionally getting on base and hoping for somebody else to bat us in. It has been said that hitting a baseball is the hardest task in sports. Overcoming temptation and not falling for sin with any consistency is the hardest task for a Christian, isn't it? Yet it is the daily goal of our spiritual at-bats. How should we proceed against this extraordinary task? Will says the first commandment of baseball is stay within yourself. That's a maxim in baseball. Stay within yourself. I found a little sports blogger on the interwebs today who offered a reflection on this commandment of baseball that I'll share with you as well. She says, stay within yourself is one of my favorite sayings, and I hear it around the ballpark all the time. Usually coaches are saying it to hitters, but it can certainly be applied to pitchers as well. It's also a great thing to remember outside of baseball. The basic premise is this: you know yourself better than anyone else. You know your strengths and weaknesses and how you're feeling on a particular day. Sometimes it's easy to let others influence your behavior. Don't. At least not so much as to get away from what makes you, you. Play to your strengths as much as possible. Have you ever felt that you were totally and completely in the zone, to use another phrase borrowed from sports? When this happened, were you really thinking about what other people around you were doing or thinking? Probably only enough to determine how you were going to respond to their actions if necessary. You were staying totally and completely within yourself. That's what it meant. And this should be our goal. It's a very good advice for the spiritual life. Stay within yourself could be a maxim of the Holy Fathers. That mindfulness that I talked about a couple weeks from a Christian perspective. And lastly, baseball is the most Christian of sports because of its end goal. To return home. To be safe. Sometimes to do it in baseball, someone has to sacrifice for you to get there. They have to go out while you run in, because you cannot make it on your own. And in faith, our return home always comes at great price. Jesus Christ himself has offered the ultimate sacrifice for us, but in doing so, he has opened the gates of paradise for us. And for this, brothers and sisters, we offer to him enduring gratitude, thanksgiving for all the blessings which we have received, both on the field of this present life and in that never-ending game to come. Amen. Christ is among us. Yes.